whether from the unrelenting work, the poor diet, or simply the whims of a harsh fate. Nearly 1 in 3 pregnancies ended that way, but life ground on as merciless and unyielding as the turn of the seasons. As Teiko dips her head over her bowl, a few words of Buddhist prayer forming themselves in her mind, a sudden kick from within makes her gasp. The child lives, impatient for its own entrance into the world. She rubs a hand over her distended belly, trying to soothe the restless spirit inside her. Boy or girl, samurai or peasant, its life will be molded by the same immutable forces that constrain her own: tradition, obligation, and unrelenting labor. The feudal system grinds on, shackling each new generation to the well-worn grooves of the past. And for the women of Teiko's village and countless others like her throughout Japan, their individual lives are subsumed in the greater imperative to bear the children, tend the home fires, and help fill the rice bowls that feed the nation. In the face of such intractable gender roles, their personal hopes and dreams are as insubstantial as wisps of smoke curling up from the cooking fire, soon extinguished. As her family finishes the meal in the customary silence, Teo gathers up the empty bowls with a weary sigh. The baby has settled, but the dull ache in her lower back persists, a physical manifestation of the ceaseless grind of her existence. She allows herself the briefest of fantasies, imagining for a moment a life free of the endless cycle of pregnancy and drudgery. But such thoughts are quickly banished, replaced by a surge of shame. To yearn for something beyond her prescribed role is a betrayal, an abdication of the responsibilities that have been drummed into Teiko since birth. She is a wife, a mother, a daughter-in-law. Her own desires are irrelevant. Harmony and submission, the twin virtues of an ideal woman, have been etched into her very bones. With an effort of will, Teo pushes herself up from the table, feeling the child shift heavily inside her. Her husband and sons have already retreated to their pallets, leaving the women to finish the cleaning up. She hands a stack of bowls to her oldest daughter, who at 9 is already well trained in the domestic arts. The girl's face is solemn as she performs her duties, no trace of youthful rebellion in her demeanor. Someday, Teo knows her daughter will be in her place, a baby on her back and another in her belly. Her feet permanently muddied from the rice fields. It is the only future she can envision for the girl, the only one that their rigidly stratified society permits. The thought brings a pang of regret, but no real surprise. As the last embers fade in the hearth and the humid darkness presses in from all sides, Teo sinks down onto her thin pallet, easing her aching body into a reclining position. She stares up at the thatched roof, barely visible in the gloom. Tomorrow will be the same as today and all the days that came before. An endless cycle of planting and harvesting, washing and mending, birthing and burying. For a woman in feudal Japan, there is no respite, no escape from the narrow confines of her prescribed roles. The seasons may turn and the years may pass, but the rhythm of her life remains as unchanging as the tide. Tiao closes her eyes, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. In the moments before sleep claims her, she sends up a silent, futile prayer, not for herself, but for the generations of women yet to come, that they may someday know a life beyond the patties and the cooking fires, a life of their own making. But such thoughts are fleeting, insubstantial as the curls of smoke that even now drift up from the banked embers and dissipate into the muggy night air. Teo's last conscious sensation is the flutter of the child in her womb, a reminder of her inescapable destiny. She surrenders herself to sleep, her mind already turning to the tasks that await her in the grey light of dawn. This is merely a glimpse into the life of one peasant woman, a single thread in the vast tapestry of feudal Japanese society. But it is a thread that repeats itself endlessly, a pattern of unremitting toil and female subservience that persists across generations and social classes. From the lowliest village to the loftiest castle, the women of this era are bound by the same rigid expectations, the same narrowly circumscribed roles. To be born female in feudal Japan was to be consigned to a life of servitude and sacrifice, with little hope of autonomy or self-determination. The weight of tradition and the inflexible hierarchy of the feudal system combined to create an existence of unrelenting hardship for women of all classes. Whether laboring in the fields or tending to the needs of their samurai husbands, their lives were defined by duty and submission. Welcome, weary traveller, through the passages of time. As the moon hangs heavy in the sky and the world grows quiet, I invite you to step with me into the pages of history. Settle in, get cozy, and let my voice carry you into the realm of dreams as we explore a captivating yet troubling chapter of Japan's feudal past. Before we begin our journey, I'd love to know who I have the pleasure of speaking to tonight. Whether you're nestled under the covers ready for sleep or simply seeking a moment of calm, go ahead and leave a comment, sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. If you enjoy immersing yourself in history as a way to unwind, consider subscribing so you never miss one of these relaxing excursions through time. Now make yourself comfortable as we prepare to peek behind the curtain of an era long past. Tonight we'll be exploring the often difficult and oppressive lives of women in feudal Japan. But don't worry, I'll be right here to guide you gently through this unfamiliar world. No matter how harsh the realities we uncover, my soothing narration will ensure you can simply lie back, listen, and let your imagination roam free. As we begin, I want you to picture yourself as a woman living in the 14th century Japan. It's hard for the modern mind to grasp just how different life was then, especially for women. With nearly every aspect of their lives tightly controlled by societal expectations, women had very little personal freedom or self-determination. From birth until death, their path was largely laid out for them, shaped by forces far beyond their control. Over the course of our time together tonight, we're going to follow in the footsteps of a typical woman as she navigates each stage of feudal Japanese life, starting from her birth and childhood through adolescence and marriage into motherhood and adult family life, and finally to her twilight years. We'll see the world through her eyes. Along the way, we'll meet some remarkable real-life women who found ways to make their mark on history despite the incredible limitations placed on them. So as you burrow deeper under the covers and feel sleep start to tug at the edges of your consciousness, let's take our first steps into feudal Japan. Breathe in deeply, breathe out slowly, and let the sounds of the present fade into the background. The only voice in your head now is mine, and the only place we are is the Japan of 600 years ago. Our story begins with a birth, but not one that is celebrated with much fanfare. For you see, in this time and place, baby girls were simply not as valued as baby boys. Families anxiously awaited the arrival of a son to carry on the family name and inherit the family estate and duties. A daughter was seen as a temporary presence, someone who would one day leave to join her husband's family. She could not continue the family lineage in the same way. At best, a girl might help with household chores until she married, but she wasn't considered a true permanent part of her birth family. In some cases, if a family already had several daughters, a newborn girl might even be a source of disappointment and burden. Although the practice was becoming less common by the feudal period, female infanticide did still occasionally happen. Baby girls were sometimes seen as just another mouth to feed until they could be married off. And not all families had the resources or desire to provide for them, callous as that may sound to our modern ears. So let's imagine that by good fortune your family chooses to keep and raise you, their infant daughter. Even from your earliest days, the expectations placed on you are clear. As you grow from a baby into a young girl, your family focuses on raising you to be subservient, obedient, humble, and skilled in domestic arts. Playing with dolls is encouraged, as it's seen as practice for one day caring for a family of your own. Watching and helping the women of the household with cleaning, cooking, sewing, and other chores is also an important part of your girlhood. Very rarely would a girl be educated in the same way as her brothers. Most girls of the samurai class might learn to read and write at a basic level, and might be taught traditional arts like calligraphy, flower arranging, or playing musical instruments. But the idea of a robust education, including classic literature, philosophy, government, and martial arts, was almost exclusively reserved for boys. A girl's education was about becoming a proper wife and mother, not an intellectual or warrior. However, even in these restrictive times, there were always some remarkable women who defied convention. One famous example from a few centuries before the feudal period we're focusing on is the author Murasaki Shikibu. Born into a noble family in the late 900s, Murasaki was given an unusually thorough education by her father, who saw great intelligence in his young daughter. She grew up to become a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court, and penned the enduring masterpiece, The Tale of Genji, considered by many to be the world's first true novel. As a young girl in feudal times, Murasaki's story may have been told to you as an apocryphal legend, a near mythical example of what women were capable of under extraordinary circumstances, but you would know that her path was the exception, not the rule. However much innate talent or ambition you might possess, your destiny is to be a wife and mother with little room for personal pursuits. And so the years of your girlhood slip away, spent close by your mother's side, learning and preparing for your inevitable future. Your world is small, just your family home, and perhaps occasional outings to a temple or market. But soon enough, usually around the age of 13 to 16, your world will suddenly expand, though not in a way of your own choosing. But you see, the time has now come for your parents to arrange your marriage. This isn't a love match. Romance has little to do with marriages in feudal Japan. Instead, your parents are looking at social position, political allegiances, and how best to strengthen the family through your match. If you're lucky, your husband will be close to your own age rather than decades older. You may have met him a few times, or he may be a total stranger. Your wishes in the matter are, of course, irrelevant. You're informed of your parents' choice and begin preparing to leave the only home you've ever known to join your husband's household. You'll be living with his parents and any siblings, becoming the lowest ranking woman in a new family. It's a daunting prospect, but as a proper feudal Japanese girl, you've been raised to be submissive and obedient. To question or resist the path laid out for you would be unthinkable. As you gather your belongings and prepare to depart from your childhood, let's pause and consider another real young woman who made this fateful journey. The Lady Tokugawa Masako was born into a powerful samurai family in 6007. At the tender age of 15, she was married off to the son of the reigning shogun. Masako suddenly found herself thrust into the very highest echelons of feudal power and intrigue. But Masako's marriage was more than just an alliance between noble families. It was a political necessity, for you see, her young husband was already being groomed to one day take over rulership of all Japan as the next shogun. This meant that Masako was under immense pressure to cement her place in the dynasty by producing an heir, a male heir. Of course, without a son to one day inherit the shogunate, her husband's family would fall from power, and Masako herself would lose any status and security. So, as Masako departed her family home as little more than a child herself, she carried the weight of dynastic ambitions on her slim shoulders. The expectations that she quickly conceive a son were just the start of a lifetime of intense duty and scrutiny in her new role. Her major purpose in life, like every woman in her time, was to bear children. We'll explore the often harrowing realities of feudal Japanese motherhood more deeply in just a little while. But first, we turn back to you, our protagonist, as you take your first steps into marriage and away from the relative familiarity and comfort of your childhood. Dressed in your finest kimono, you take your place beside your new husband, bowing low to your new in-laws. Your old life is over now. Your role is to serve your husband's household, your childhood home, your family. Even your birth name will fade into memory. As a new bride, you're expected to quickly learn the ways of your husband's household. His mother is now your main taskmaster, critic, and teacher. She shows you how she likes the meals prepared, the correct way to wash and mend the family's clothes, the proper rituals for honoring the household's ancestors. Make a mistake or show any hint of homesickness or resistance, and your mother-in-law will quickly scold you. You must embody the ideal of the good wife, humble, gentle, obedient, and above all, fertile, for that is the real measure of your worth in this new role. The children you'll bear, specifically the sons, you're likely to become pregnant within the first year of marriage, as your husband will visit your bed frequently. Contraception is virtually non-existent, and you have no real right to refuse your husband's sexual advances. Your body is now largely under his and his family's command. As your belly grows heavy with your first child, you continue your daily chores as a young wife for as long as you can. Hopefully, your mother-in-law will show you some kindness as your pregnancy advances, perhaps allowing you to rest a bit more or eat a little extra food. But pregnancy is not considered an illness or a handicap. You're still expected to fulfill your household duties as a woman for as long as possible. Let's turn again, briefly, from your story to consider another real woman who exemplified the life of the typical feudal Japanese wife. A generation or two before your time, there lived a woman named Nano Teao. Born into a poor peasant family in the early 1600s, to married a local rice farmer as a teenager and immediately set to work alongside him in the patties, up to her knees in mud, even as her children grew inside her. Over the years, Taiko bore 6 children for her husband, working in the fields before and after each birth. As a peasant woman, she didn't have the luxury of focusing solely on the home like samurai or noble-class wives. No, Teko and her husband just barely eked out a living farming their small plot of land, so her help with the back-breaking labor was crucial. 2 of her babies died in infancy, not uncommon for the time. The exhaustion and poor nutrition that were part of the peasant lifestyle made pregnancy and childbirth even more risky. And so Teko soldiered on like most women of her era, sacrificing her own health and comfort for the sake of her husband and surviving children. She had no other real choice or alternative path available to her. From sun up to sundown, she worked either out in the fields or inside preparing food, mending clothes, and trying to stretch what little they had to keep the family alive. Hers was a lifetime of harsh subsistence and endless toil. Back now to you, our protagonist, hopefully born into a slightly higher class than Teko, but still bound by many of the same welly expectations. As your pregnancy progresses and your delivery day approaches, you say extra prayers to Shinto kami and Buddhist to protect you and your baby in the dangers of childbirth. You've heard enough whispered stories of women in your family and community dying in the process to know the risks. When your pains begin, you retreat to a special birthing room in your house, aided by a midwife and perhaps a few other experienced women. You labor bravely, but with trepidation. There's no real medical knowledge of the childbirth process in your time, so if complications arise, there's little to be done, no doctors, no hospitals, none of the interventions that could save you or your baby if things go wrong. All you can do is grit your teeth, push when directed, and hope for the best. To your immense relief, you deliver a squalling infant after many grueling hours. And to your even greater fortune and delight, the midwife announces that you've delivered a healthy baby boy on your first try. You know that your husband and in-laws will be overjoyed at the news. In their eyes and the eyes of society, you've just proven your worth as a woman and wife. A son to carry on the family name is the greatest gift you could give your husband's household. In the coming days, as you recover from the physical trauma of childbirth, you pour your energy into nourishing and doting on your precious son. As a samurai-class wife, you're spared from returning to work immediately, instead expected to focus on baby's care. You nurse your son, swaddle him tight, sing him lullabies, and shower him with affection. Your husband, too, takes great joy in this new heir. If you had instead delivered a daughter, of course, the family would still welcome her, but the celebrations would be a bit more muted. As you now well know, a daughter will one day leave the family to marry, while your son will stay and inherit his father's role and status. You will raise your daughter with love, yes, but also with the knowledge that you're grooming her for a life of service to her future husband, just like your mother did for you. But we don't have to dwell on that bittersweet thought, for your story includes the birth of a cherished son. As he grows from a helpless infant into a rambunctious toddler and young boy, you take great pride in caring for and shaping him. It's your duty to instill in him the virtues of your samurai class: loyalty, courage, honor, discipline. Your husband handles his formal education and martial arts training, but you're always there in the background as the loving, patient, ever-attendant mother. As your son grows, so too does your family. You give birth 4 more times over the next decade, 2 more sons and 2 daughters. Each pregnancy and delivery is as nerve-wracking as the first, but you feel more confidence in your role as a mother now. role as a mother. You delegate household chores to your daughters as soon as they're old enough, training them to be proper wives one day, just like your mother-in-law did for you. And so the years pass and your children grow. Your role is still primarily in the home, focused on your offspring and keeping domestic affairs running smoothly. When your husband is away at battle or for official duties, you're in charge of the household, making sure bills are paid, servants are managed, and the family wants for nothing. You take pride in your efficiency and capability in this sphere. In a few ways, your life is easier than a woman of a lower class in your era. You don't have to do hard physical labor, and you have servants to handle some menial tasks. But in many ways, the life of a samurai wife is still just as restricted and circumscribed. While a peasant woman might work alongside her husband and have slightly more say in their shared life, a samurai wife is still subservient and separate from her husband's world of politics and war. All of these class differences would have been strictly regulated by law in your feudal era. Japan's class system was rigidly enforced with rules around what each tier could wear, eat, and even how they could style their hair. As a samurai woman, you could be punished for wearing silk reserved for the nobility, for example, and a peasant woman could be harshly disciplined for putting on airs above her station. There was very little mobility between the classes, but even within the samurai class, women were second-class citizens compared to men. Sure, samurai women enjoyed a more refined lifestyle than women of lower classes, but they were still subject to the same limitations on personal freedoms, legal rights, and education. A peasant woman and a samurai woman alike could not travel freely, own property, choose their own husband, or pursue interests outside of the approved welly arts. There were, however, always some exceptional women who managed to break the mold of the stereotypical passive samurai wife. One famous example was Hojo Masako, who lived about a century before our feudal protagonist's time. Masako was married to the first Kamakura shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, and was renowned for her intelligence, bravery, and political acumen. Unlike most samurai wives who stayed meekly in the background, Masako was a key advisor to her husband, weighing in on matters of state and strategy. She was a skilled archer and even joined him on military campaigns. After his death, Maso maneuvered her family into power, making decisions in her son's name and thwarting attempted coups against her clan. While she was eventually forced to become a Buddhist nun in her later years, she continued wielding influence from the convent until her death. But Masako's level of education and involvement in politics and warfare was incredibly rare for a woman of her time. She was able to make her mark on history, in part because of her unusually high status as wife of the shogun and her force of personality that refused to stay confined solely to the domestic sphere. Her story would have certainly been known to later generations of samurai women like yourself, a tantalizing glimmer of what more your life could be if only society allowed it. But alas for the vast majority of women in feudal Japan, Masako's path was an impossible dream. Your own path, while perhaps stable and comfortable compared to a peasant woman, is still a narrow and predetermined one. Your value comes from your role as a wife and mother within your husband's household, not from any individual talent, ambition, or interests of your own. So let's return again to your tale, shall we? The years have flown by, and your eldest son is now a young man of 16, almost fully grown. Your two younger boys are not far behind, both strong and healthy, Sam. Life as a peasant woman in feudal Japan was one of unceasing toil with precious few comforts or respites. From before dawn until after dusk, the work of maintaining a household and contributing to the family's livelihood occupied nearly every waking moment. For Nano Teko, the day began in darkness as she rose from her pallet on the dirt floor. Careful not to wake her snoring husband and the younger children still curled up asleep, she stirred the embers in the hearth, coaxing them back to life, to boil water for the morning's meager rice porridge. As the sky lightened to grey, she tied back her hair, dampened with sweat from the muggy morning air that promised another sweltering day in the fields. By the time her family roused and gathered around the low wooden table, Teo had already been up for more than an hour, tending to the myriad tasks that kept the household running, mending clothes, sweeping the packed earth, washing the dishes from the night before. The work of a peasant woman was never done. After a hasty breakfast, gulped down in silence, the men, her husband, and two oldest sons headed out to the rice paddies, the plots of land their feudal lord allowed them to till in exchange for their labor and loyalty. Although only in her mid-30s, Teo's face was deeply etched from years of worry and exertion, her hands calloused and prematurely aged. As a young bride, she had moved into her husband's family home, the typical fate for village girls. Her mother-in-law, a stern matriarch who ruled the household, put Teo immediately to work, cooking, cleaning, and serving the men. But Teo's primary purpose, like that of all wives, was to produce children, especially sons, to inherit the family property and carry on the ancestral line. She was fortunate in that respect, having borne her husband two healthy boys within the first few years of marriage. But the births were difficult. Long labours on the bare floor of the hut, with only her mother-in-law and a village midwife to help. Teo screamed herself hoarse and tore her vocal cords, leaving her with a permanently raspy voice. She considered it a small price to pay for living sons. The babies came regularly after that, every 2 years or so, with little rest between pregnancies and no respite from her daily chores. Teo grew thin and exhausted, aging decades in the space of a few years. 2 more boys followed, and then, to her dismay, a pair of daughters. Although she cherished all her children, Teo knew that girls were considered a burden, another mouth to feed, until they married out of the family. She quietly apologized to her husband, feeling she had somehow failed him. As soon as they were old enough to walk steadily, Teko put her daughters to work around the house and brought them out with her to the fields. Unlike her sons, who would attend the village school to learn reading and writing, Teo's girls would receive no education. Their futures, like their mothers, lay solely in domestic servitude, first to their parents and later to their husbands. It pained Teko to imagine such limited prospects for her bright, lively daughters, but she saw no other path for them in their rigidly structured feudal world. With the younger children in tow, Teo spent her days bent over in the paddies, alongside the men, knee-deep in the muddy water, as she helped plant, weed, and harvest the rice crop that sustained them both physically and economically. There were no weekends or holidays, only a ceaseless cycle of planting and reaping, broken up by the occasional village festival or religious ceremony. Even when heavy with child, Teko's work continued unabated. She muffled her groans of pain as she crouched over the rows of rice seedlings, her belly swollen and straining against her rough cotton kimono, squinting into the harsh sun glinting off the patties. Takiko blinked away the sweat and tears that mingled freely on her face, feeling the child roil inside her, as if in protest of its constricted, laborious confinement. Thoughts of her unborn baby filled Tako with an overwhelming mix of emotions. Hope that it would be another healthy son to bring pride to the family. Fear of complications or a difficult birth without even rudimentary medical help. A touch of bitter resignation at the realization that her own life would be cut short by these repeated pregnancies and deliveries, an almost inevitably fatal burden in an era of sky-high maternal mortality. As the sun gradually sank over the lush green patchwork of the rice fields, Teo straightened up painfully, pressing one dirt-caked hand to the small of her back, where the ache was sharpest. She gathered her daughters who had spent the day chasing away hungry birds from the grain, and began the slow trudge back to the village, empty baskets balanced precariously on her head. Behind her, Teko's husband and sons shouldered their tools, staring resignedly at their feet. Nobody spoke. The work itself was so exhausting that conserving energy for conversation was an unfamiliar luxury. In any case, Tako reflected, what was there to discuss? Their lives were circumscribed by the never-ending struggle to coax enough food from the land to fill their bellies and pay their taxes. Season after season, year after year, with no variation or respite, only the numb, mute rituals of survival. Back inside the close confines of the family's hut, Teo kindles the cooking fire again and begins preparing the evening meal. As the rice pot bubbles and the pickled vegetables are laid out, she assembles the entire family around the low table, differentially serving her husband and sons first before sitting down to her own supper. In the smoky dimness, Teo surveys her family, the flame light flickering over their tired faces. With a stab of melancholy, she dwells for a moment on the daughter she will never know. The one she miscarried in the fields years before, expelling a gush of blood and tissue into the uncaring mud. Their individual identities subsumed by the greater imperatives of family and society. It's a stark and unforgiving portrait, a world where even the most basic rights and freedoms are denied to half the population based solely on their gender. And yet, even within these suffocating constraints, there were women who managed to carve out a measure of agency and influence, subverting the rigid norms of their society in subtle and extraordinary ways. In the noble halls of the samurai and the cloistered chambers of the imperial court, a handful of exceptional women left their mark on history, wielding power and shaping events through their intelligence, their artistry, and their sheer force of will. These are the stories that puncture the bleak tapestry of female oppression, the glimmers of light in an otherwise dark and stifling landscape. In the centuries to come, as Japan slowly emerged from its feudal past and began its halting journey towards modernity, the legacy of these remarkable women would endure, inspiring new generations to challenge the status quo and demand a better future. But for Teko and her countless sisters in suffering, such change would come too late. Their lives forever bound by the implacable dictates of a society that saw them as little more than chat and child-bearers. As we trace the long and winding path of Japanese history, it's impossible to ignore the central role that women played in shaping its course, even as they were relegated to the margins and denied the most basic rights and freedoms. Theirs is a story of resilience and quiet determination in the face of overwhelming odds. A testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in even the most oppressive of circumstances. And so we leave Teko to her dreamless slumber, her body heavy with the weight. She changed his diapers, sang him lullabies, and watched him toddle after their father in the fields with envy. The same fields were where Aki spent most of her days. She learned to plant rice seedlings in neat rows, her back bent under the hot sun for hours. A restless and clever girl, Aki peppered her father and grandfather with questions as they worked. Why do we grow this type of rice? How do the daimyo lords decide our taxes? What lies beyond the mountains ringing their village? But her curiosity was usually met with grunts, shrugs, or rebukes to focus on her tasks. Aki's quick mind was seen as more nuisance than asset for a peasant girl. It was her mother and grandmother's job to train her in the domestic arts expected of a future wife: cooking, cleaning, sewing, weaving. Every day, Aki watched her mother grind barley, haul water, mend clothes, and stir the pot of millet porridge over their hearth fire, a baby strapped to her back. She rarely saw her mother sit down or rest. Around age 6, Aki started to join her sisters in these daily household chores. Their rough hands grew calluses from gripping farm tools, stirring pots, scrubbing floors. Aki missed the freedom of running through the rice paddies with her brother and his friends, flying kites and catching crickets. Now she was learning to serve, to be as silent and efficient as her mother. The local Buddhist temple, her one refuge besides the fields, taught that women's suffering in this life was punishment for misdeeds in past ones. Only male monks were allowed to study the sutras. One of Aki's few childhood delights was the village Matsuri festival each year. She loved the colorful banners fluttering from bamboo poles, the troupe of musicians and acrobats that performed in the square. Aki longed to try the drums and flutes herself, or learn the graceful dances, but girls were shooed away from the male-only entertainers. Instead, she had to content herself with clapping along to the music and savoring a few bites of dango dumplings. Those fleeting festival moments of lively energy sustained her through long days of drudgery. As Aki entered adolescence, her mother began to eye her appraisingly, judging if she was ready for marriage. Aki's belly tightened with dread when she overheard her father speaking with the village matchmaker. She knew that marriage meant leaving her family forever to join her husband's household. The very word yomi for wife meant one who lives in another place. Aki prayed she would be matched with a kind husband, not a cruel one who would beat her as some men did their wives. She had no say in the matter. At 15, Aki was informed she would be marrying the second son of a wealthier farming family 2 villages over. She met her betrothed only once before the wedding at the formal matchmaking ceremony. They knelt across from each other, sipping cups of sake and avoiding eye contact. He was a stranger to her. Aki wondered if he too felt trapped by family obligations and dreamt of another life. The wedding passed in a blur of unfamiliar faces and 2 tight wedding kimono. Aki was officially a yomi now, and her only role was to serve her new family. From dawn to dusk she was at the beck and call of her strict father-in-law and critical mother-in-law, tending to their every need. Her husband, who seemed meek and browbeaten himself, was out working the fields all day. At night, he visited her chambers to do his husbandly duties. Aki stared at the ceiling and willed her mind elsewhere. It wasn't long before Aki missed her menstrual cycle and realized she was pregnant. When her son was born healthy and squalling, the family celebrated, and Aki felt a rush of love and pride. But her mother-in-law quickly took charge, whisking the infant away to be nursed by his grandmother, as was the custom. Aki ashed for her baby as she recovered from the birth, breasts heavy with milk. The separation felt like losing a piece of herself. As more children followed over the years, including 3 daughters, Aki grew to accept her lot in life. She was luckier than many women. The harvests were good. Her husband was not unkind, and they could feed their children most days. Aki's existence revolved around serving others from sun up to sundown. She hauled water from the village well, pounded mochi rice cakes till her arms ached, and stitched indigo-dyed cotton clothes for the family. In rare breaks, she caught up on village gossip with other wives and snuck her children sweets when the grandparents weren't looking. Aki took solace in the little joys and rituals that marked the passing seasons. The cherry blossom picnics in spring, the star festival in summer, the harvest celebrations in fall, the New Year dishes in winter. She saved tales and wisdom to pass on to her daughters, knowing the constraints they would face in this society. They could not inherit land, learn to read, or choose their fates, but they could find meaning in small freedoms and the bonds between women. Aki fretted over their marriages in safety as her hair greyed and her own marriage settled into companionable silence. In her 50s, Aki was considered an old woman. She had been fortunate to survive the dangers of multiple childbirths. Now a widow, she finally held some authority in the family as a mother-in-law herself. But her body was worn out from decades of toil. Aki's aching joints and cloudy eyes turned her attention inward. She thought often of the Pure Land, the Buddhist paradise that supposedly awaited her. Reciting the Nambutsu prayer on her dew beads brought some peace. When the clan wars reached their village and she had to flee with her children and grandchildren, Aki realized how fragile their lives had always been. She found herself depending on her son and grandson for survival. Now they resettled and rebuilt, replanting fields and repairing thatched roofs. Aki did not live to see her youngest granddaughter, a bright and defiant girl, learn to write in secret from a monk who took pity on her, but she would have recognized that restless curiosity, that yearning for a bigger life. Aki's story was one of quiet endurance through a lifetime of duty and drudgery, but it was also stitched through with moments of beauty, laughter, love, humanity, shining through the hardships. She left no record of her inner world like most common women of her era. But she was a link in a chain of mothers and daughters stretching back through the centuries in feudal Japan. They bent like reeds but were never broken. Over generations, some of these women found ways to push at the edges of their constraints. A few rebelled openly, taking up arms or shaving their heads to join monasteries. Others subverted expectations more subtly as artists and writers, or merchants and innkeepers. Quietly, they shaped the consciousness of their society and passed on a legacy of resilience. Aki could not have imagined the very different life of an ordinary Japanese woman today. One with education, careers, choices her era could not dream of, but she and all the forgotten foremothers made those futures possible through their uncelebrated fortitude. In pondering their stories, perhaps we can draw on some of that strength in our own challenging times and plant seeds of change in our turn. The river of history flows on, carrying us all in its current, and women continue to reshape it in ways big and small. Life in feudal Japan was a constant struggle for survival, and this was especially true for women. While men faced their own hardships and challenges, the weight of societal expectations, rigid gender roles, and lack of personal freedoms created a particularly difficult existence for females from all walks of life. From the moment a girl was born, her life was shaped by the fact that she was seen as less valuable than a male child. Many families hoped for sons to carry on the family name and to provide for them in their old age. Daughters were often seen as a burden, just another mouth to feed until they could be married off. In some cases, if a family had too many girls, they might even resort to the desperate act of female infanticide. Although this practice was becoming less common by the feudal period. For the girls who did survive, their upbringing was focused on preparing them for their eventual roles as wives and mothers. From a young age, girls were taught to be subservient, obedient, and skilled in domestic tasks like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. They were expected to be soft-spoken, demure, and to always defer to the men in their lives. There were a few exceptional cases of girls who managed to get a more well-rounded education, usually because they came from wealthy or influential families. One famous example is Murasaki Shikibu, who lived in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. She was able to receive the kind of education normally reserved for males studying Chinese classics and Buddhist scriptures. Murasaki went on to become a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court and wrote The Tale of Genji, considered the world's first novel and a masterpiece of Japanese literature. But for the vast majority of girls, the opportunity to learn and expand their minds was simply out of reach. As girls reached adolescence, usually around the age of 13 to 16, they were considered ready for marriage. Marriages were almost always arranged by the parents with little or no input from the young bride herself. The goal of these unions was not love or personal happiness, but rather to produce children and to strengthen the ties between two families or to forge political alliances. One poignant example is the story of Tokugawa Masako, who was married off at the tender age of 15 to the powerful feudal lord Tokugawa Ieyasu. Masako was the daughter of a rival clan leader, and the marriage was arranged to bring peace between the two warring families. But for Masako, it meant being torn away from her home and thrust into a new life where she was expected to bear a male heir for her husband. The pressure on young brides like Masako was immense, and failure to produce a son could lead to shame, scorn, or even divorce. Once married, a woman's life revolved around her duties as a wife and mother. She was expected to move into her husband's family home, where she had to navigate the complex web of relationships with her new in-laws. Her primary role was to bear children, particularly sons, and to raise them according to the strict social norms of the time. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, spending their days cooking, cleaning, sewing, and tending to the needs of their husbands and children. The challenges of motherhood in feudal Japan cannot be overstated. With limited access to medicine and proper nutrition, pregnancy and childbirth were risky endeavors. Many women died in childbirth and infant mortality rates were high. Those who did survive often had to endure multiple pregnancies over the course of their lives, as large families were the norm. For women of the lower classes like the peasantry, motherhood was even more demanding. Not only did they have to care for their children and manage the household, but they were also expected to work alongside their husbands in the fields, planting and harvesting crops to ensure their family's survival. The story of Nano Tiko, a peasant woman who lived during the early Edo period, illustrates just how difficult this life could be. Teko bore 6 children while working tirelessly on her family's farm, with little rest or respite from her daily toil. Of course, women's experiences in feudal Japan were not monolithic, and much depended on their social class and status. The rigid hierarchy of feudal society meant that there was little social mobility, and women were bound by the strict laws and customs that regulated every aspect of their lives, from the clothes they could wear to the food they could eat. At the bottom of the social ladder were the peasant women, who made up the vast majority of the population. They lived hard lives of manual labor, working in the fields alongside their husbands and children to grow the rice and other crops that sustained the nation. They had few comforts and little leisure time, and were often at the mercy of their local lords and samurai. Slightly above the peasantry were the merchant and artisan classes, which began to grow and thrive during the later feudal period. Women in these families might have had a little more economic security and some access to education, particularly if they were involved in the family business, but they were still subject to the same rigid gender roles and expectations as women in other classes. The samurai class, the warrior elite of feudal Japan, had its own unique challenges and opportunities for women. Samurai women were expected to embody the same ideals of loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice as their male counterparts. They were often trained in the martial arts and were expected to defend their homes and families if necessary. Some samurai women became renowned warriors in their own right, like Nano Teko, who fought and died bravely in the Battle of Aizu during the Meiji Restoration. But even within the samurai class, women's lives were heavily circumscribed by their gender. They were expected to marry for the good of their family and clan, and to produce male heirs to carry on the family name. They had to navigate the complex politics of the samurai world, where alliances and loyalties were constantly shifting. One powerful example of a samurai woman who rose to prominence in this world was Hojo Masako, who lived in the 13th century. Masako was married to the regent Hojo Tokimasa, and after his death she became a powerful political figure in her own right. She was known as the nun shogun because of her deep devotion to Buddhism, but also because of her shrewd political acumen. Masako worked tirelessly behind the scenes to protect the interests of her clan and to maintain their power and influence. At the very top of the social hierarchy were the noble women, the wives and daughters of the daimyo lords and the imperial family. These women lived lives of luxury and privilege, with access to the finest clothes, food, and entertainment, but they were also the most tightly controlled and regulated of all the women in feudal society. Noble women were expected to be models of feminine grace and beauty, skilled in the arts of music, poetry, and calligraphy. They were rarely seen in public, spending most of their lives in the secluded inner chambers of their families' castles and estates. Their marriages were carefully arranged to forge political alliances and to ensure the continuation of the noble bloodlines. Despite the rigid constraints placed on women in feudal Japan, there were some who managed to break free of the mold and make their mark on history. These were the exceptions. The women who defied convention and found ways to express themselves and assert their agency in a society that gave them little room to do so. One such woman was Yumo no Akuni, a shrine maiden who lived in the early 17th century. Okuni is credited with inventing the art form known as kabuki theatre, which began as a bawdy satirical form of dance and performance. Buni and her troupe of female performers would dress in men's clothing and perform dances and skits that poked fun at the samurai class and the social norms of the day. Kabuki quickly became popular among the merchant and artisan classes who enjoyed its irreverent humor and bold style. Another remarkable woman who challenged the gender norms of her time was Machisuki Chiome, a noble woman who lived in the 16th century. Chiome was the wife of a powerful samurai lord, but she was also a skilled warrior and strategist in her own right. She is famous for creating an all-female group of ninjas who served as spies and assassins for her husband's clan. These kunoichi were trained in the arts of espionage, disguise, and combat, and they played a crucial role in gathering intelligence and carrying out covert missions. But women like Okuni and Chiom were rare exceptions in a society that placed so many restrictions on women's lives. For the vast majority of women in feudal Japan, life was a constant struggle against the limitations placed on them by their gender and social class. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of these limitations can be seen in the legal system of feudal Japan. Women had very few legal rights and were considered to be inferior to men in almost every way. They could not own property, inherit wealth, or even choose their own spouses. They were subject to a strict code of conduct that governed every aspect of their behavior, from the way they dressed to the way they spoke. One particularly egregious example of the legal inequalities faced by women was the practice of katsugo. This was a form of punishment in which a woman could be beaten or even killed by her husband or father for perceived offenses like infidelity or disobedience. Men, on the other hand, were free to take concubines and engage in extramarital affairs without fear of legal consequences. The fact that women had so few legal protections made them vulnerable to abuse and exploitation at the hands of men. Divorce was only allowed in cases where the wife was deemed to be at fault. And even then, the process was heavily biased in favor of the husband. Women who were divorced or widowed often had no means of supporting themselves and were forced to rely on the charity of male relatives or to turn to prostitution to survive. Despite these grim realities, there were some small glimmers of hope for women in feudal Japan. Some lords and samurai recognized the injustice of the system and took steps to protect the women under their care. One notable example was the daimyo Wasugi Kenshin, who ruled over a province in the 16th century. Kenshin was known for his enlightened policies towards women, which included prohibiting the practice of katsugo and providing education and training for girls in his domain. But these were small victories in a society that was fundamentally stacked against women. The prevailing attitudes towards gender were deeply ingrained in the culture and reinforced by the major religious and philosophical traditions of the time. Buddhism, which had been introduced to Japan in the 6th century, taught that women were inherently inferior to men and that they were more prone to sin and desire. Women were seen as a hindrance to men's spiritual enlightenment, and many Buddhist texts warned against the dangers of attachment to women. Shinto, the native religion of Japan, also had a complex and often contradictory view of women. On the one hand, Shinto mythology celebrated powerful female deities like Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and the idea that women's bodies were sacred temples. But on the other hand, Shinto beliefs also perpetuated the idea that women were spiritually unclean, particularly during menstruation and childbirth. These religious and cultural beliefs had a profound impact on the way that women were treated in feudal society. They were used to justify the strict social hierarchy and the limitations placed on women's freedoms and opportunities, and they created a culture of shame and secrecy around women's bodies and experiences. One particularly pernicious example of this was the practice of kagari, or spiritual pollution. Women were believed to be inherently impure, particularly during menstruation and after childbirth. They were often secluded in separate rooms or huts during these times, and were forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies or entering sacred spaces. This belief in women's impurity also had practical consequences for their daily lives. Women were often banned from certain occupations like brewing sake or preparing food for religious festivals because of the fear that they would contaminate the products with their impurity. And in some cases, women were even blamed for natural disasters or crop failures as their perceived impurity was thought to anger the gods. Despite these deeply ingrained beliefs, there were some women in feudal Japan who found ways to challenge the status quo and to assert their spiritual authority. One such woman was the Empress Komo, who lived in the 8th century. Komo was a devout Buddhist who used her position as empress to promote the religion and to establish temples and nunneries throughout Japan. Komo was particularly concerned with the welfare of women and the poor. She established a number of charity hospitals and refugees for women who were fleeing abusive marriages or who had been widowed or abandoned. She also donated large sums of money to support women who had taken vows as Buddhist nuns, and she encouraged other noble women to follow her example. But even a woman as powerful as Ko could not completely escape the limitations placed on her by her gender. She was still expected to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother, and she faced criticism and opposition from some quarters for her religious and charitable activities. As women aged and reached the later stages of life, they faced new challenges and limitations. By the time a woman reached her 40s or 50s, she was considered to be old in feudal society, and her role changed accordingly. Many women of the peasant class who had labored hard in the fields alongside their husbands and children found themselves widowed and without support in their later years. They might have to rely on their sons or other male relatives to provide for them, or they might turn to begging to survive. Women of the merchant class who had spent their lives working in their husbands' shops and businesses often face similar challenges. If their husbands died before them, they might be left without a source of income or a means of support. Some widows were able to continue running the family business, but they often faced discrimination and obstacles from male competitors and customers. For samurai women, the later stages of life might bring a different set of challenges. Many samurai women outlived their husbands, who often died young in battle or from illness. These women were expected to maintain the family honor and to carry on the samurai legacy even as they grieved the loss of their husbands and sons. One such woman was Hojo Masako, the nun shogun who wielded political power throughout her life. After the death of her husband, Masako took vows as a Buddhist nun and retired to a temple. But she continued to be involved in the political intrigues of the time, using her influence to protect the interests of her clan. For some women, the later stages of life brought a sense of freedom and opportunity. They might become nuns or devote themselves to religious practices, finding solace and meaning in their faith. They might go on pilgrimages to holy sites or sponsor the construction of temples and shrines. But for many women, the end of life was a time of loneliness, hardship, and dependence. They had to rely on the goodwill of their male relatives or the charity of strangers to survive, and they faced the prospect of illness and infirmity without the benefit of modern medicine or care. Looking back on the lives of women in feudal Japan, it is clear that they faced incredible challenges and hardships. From the moment of their birth, they were seen as inferior to men and were denied the basic rights and freedoms that we take for granted today. They were expected to be obedient, docile, and subservient, and to put the needs of their husbands and families above their own. And yet, despite these incredible odds, there were women who found ways to resist and to assert their agency in small and large ways. There were women who became warriors, artists, and leaders who challenged the status quo and fought for a better life for themselves and their sisters. These women were the exceptions, but they remind us of the incredible resilience and strength of the human spirit. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who will fight for justice and equality, who will refuse to be silenced or marginalized. And as we look back on the lives of these women, we can also see the ways in which their struggles continue to resonate today. Many of the attitudes and beliefs about gender that were prevalent in feudal Japan have persisted in some form or another into the modern era. Women in Japan and around the world continue to face discrimination, violence, and inequality, and the fight for gender justice is far from over. But by remembering the stories of the women who came before us, we can draw strength and inspiration from their courage and their perseverance. We can honor their memories by continuing the work that they began, by fighting for a world in which every person, regardless of their gender, is treated with dignity and respect. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of women in feudal Japan, let us take a moment to imagine ourselves in their place. Let us imagine the daily struggles and hardships they faced, the moments of joy and sorrow, the dreams and desires that they carried in their hearts. And let us remember that each of these women was a unique and valuable individual with her own story to tell and her own contribution to make to the world. Let us honor their memory by telling their stories, by keeping their legacies alive, and by working to create a world in which every woman can live a life of dignity, freedom, and fulfillment. As we've seen, the life of a woman in feudal Japan was shaped from birth by strict gender roles and societal expectations. For a girl born into a samurai family, her destiny would be tied to the fortunes and affairs of her clan. One such woman was Hoyo Masako, born in 1156 into the powerful Hojo clan. As the daughter of a wealthy samurai lord, Masako enjoyed a privileged upbringing, but also faced immense pressure to conform to the ideals of a proper samurai wife. She would be a key political player in the tumultuous world of feudal Japan. Masako's life took a pivotal turn when at age 15 she was married off to the young Shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo. It was a political match designed to form an alliance between the Minamoto and Hojo clans. MSO dutifully moved into her husband's household and took on the role of a samurai wife, managing the estate, entertaining guests, and most importantly, bearing an heir to carry on the family name. As the wife of an ambitious warlord, Masako found herself at the heart of the struggle for power in feudal Japan. When her husband Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate in 1192, Masako became the most powerful woman in the nation. She embraced this role, serving as a trusted advisor to Yoritomo and helping him govern his domain. But Masiko's true test came after Yoritomo's sudden death in 1199. With her two young sons next in line to become shogun, Maso fought fiercely to protect their claim against rival clans. She maneuvered her father and other male relatives into key government positions, ensuring the Hojo clan's dominance. When her eldest son proved to be an ineffectual ruler and was assassinated, Masako installed her younger son as a puppet shogun, ruling in his name. For over 20 years, Masako was the de facto ruler of Japan, making decisions in all military and political matters. She navigated the cutthroat world of feudal power politics with skill and ruthlessness, eliminating rivals and suppressing rebellions. Masako's story shows how some exceptional women could wield influence in feudal Japan, even as wives and mothers confined to the private sphere. But even a woman as powerful as Masako couldn't escape the strictures and tragedies of her time. She endured the deaths of multiple children and grandchildren, some by assassination. And despite her political acumen, as a woman, she always had to rule through male figureheads. First her husband, then her sons. In her later years, Masako took the tonsure and became a Buddhist nun, as many noble women did in old age. She retired to a temple, but still continued to influence Hojo clan politics from behind the scenes until her death at age 69. Her legacy is that of a formidable woman who tenaciously seized and wielded power in a man's world, shaping the course of Japanese history. For ordinary women in feudal Japan, life was much more limited and precarious than for a noble woman like Masako. A peasant woman's lot was one of hard labor and childbearing with few comforts or respites. Imagine a farmer's wife in a small rural village sometime in the 14th century. To give her a name, let's call her May. May likely married in her mid-teens to a husband chosen by her father. As a new bride, she would have moved into her husband's family home, becoming the lowest-ranking woman in the household. May's daily life revolved around an endless cycle of domestic and agricultural chores. She rose before dawn to prepare the morning meal, served her husband and in-laws first, and ate only their leftovers. She spent her days planting and weeding in the fields, tending the vegetable garden, mending clothes, cleaning and hauling water. In the evenings she cooked and served dinner and might do some spinning or sewing by lamplight before bed. As taxing as this regimen was, May's most important duty was to bear children, especially sons, to inherit the family plot. She likely gave birth every 2 or 3 years with little rest from her labors. Many of her babies probably perished in infancy from malnutrition or disease. May herself might have died young from complications of pregnancy or the sheer physical toll of her hardships. If she survived, May had little to look forward to in old age, especially if she was widowed with no sons to support her. She might hope her decades of toil would earn her a slightly higher status in the household as a mother-in-law, but she would remain dependent on her male kin. May and millions of peasant women like her were the largely unseen and unsung bedrock of feudal Japanese society. While histories acclaimed the deeds of male samurai and shoguns, it was the grueling labor of peasant women that sustained the nation's agrarian economy. Their sacrifices and suffering were taken for granted in a social order that saw women's subordination as natural and necessary. Of course, not all women in feudal Japan were wives and mothers. Some found ways to live outside of conventional family roles, even if these paths came with their own hardships. In the pleasure quarters of cities like Edo and Kyoto, some women worked as courtesans, entertainers, and geisha. While this profession offered more independence than marriage, it still functioned within a strict hierarchy controlled by men. Successful courtesans might wield a degree of influence by charming and advising powerful clients, but they remained vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Other women opted for a religious life, becoming nuns in Buddhist temples. This was one of the few escapes from marriage available to women. As nuns, they could devote themselves to study and spiritual practice, and some gained respect as teachers or abbesses. However, they had to cut all ties with their families, shave their heads, and live with the stigma of celibacy in a society that prized fertility. A few remarkable women even made their mark in the male-dominated realm of the arts. Murasaki Shikibu, born around 978, became a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court and authored the tale of Genji, considered the world's first novel. Her lyrical saga of courtly life offered a rare female perspective on the intrigues and aesthetics of the Heian era elite. Other women made contributions in literature, poetry, calligraphy, and music. The 12th century poet Akazamem Iman, for instance, perfected the waka form and taught other women writers. These artistic pursuits were still practiced within the constraints of court life, where women's voices were often marginalized or appropriated by men, but they testify to the indomitable creativity and intellect of women who found ways to express themselves within suffocating limitations. As the feudal era progressed into the Edo period, the status of women gradually became even more restricted. Neo-Confucian ideas which stressed strict gender roles, female subservience, gained dominance. The ideal of the good wife, wise mother, who was totally devoted to serving her husband and children, became more deeply entrenched. Paradoxically, economic growth and urbanization made life somewhat easier for many women with a bit less material deprivation. But this was offset by the solidifying of a patriarchal system that increasingly confined women to the narrowest of spheres and the heaviest of expectations. By the dawn of the modern era in the late 19th century, Japanese women would find themselves grappling with a legacy of subordination and limitation that was in many ways more rigid and codified than ever before. The road to greater freedoms and gender equality would be a long and arduous one, built on the resilience of generations of women who survived in a male-dominated world. So, as we ponder the incredible challenges faced by women in feudal Japan, we can take a moment to appreciate their strength, resourcefulness, and dignity in an era that granted them so little. From the unsung peasant wife to the influential noblewoman, from the cloistered nun to the expressive artist, each woman navigated the cruel constraints of her circumstances in her own way. Their stories deserve to be remembered and honored, not just as a dark chapter in history, but as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of women through the ages. Though long denied a voice of their own, the women of feudal Japan still speak to us today of the timeless struggle for autonomy, respect, and self-determination. In listening to their stories, we keep their memories alive and carry forward their legacy of resilience. And so as we drift off to sleep, let us hold a space of contemplation for these remarkable women of a distant time and place who endured so much hardship and yet managed to leave their indelible mark on history. May their fortitude and grace continue to inspire us in our own struggles and triumphs across the ages. Through their fortitude and resilience, some women managed to carve out meaningful lives and even exert influence within feudal Japan's patriarchal confines. One such remarkable figure was Hojo Masako, born in 1156 to a powerful samurai family. At age 13, she was married off to the rising warlord Minamoto no Yoritomo in a political alliance typical of her class and era. As Yoritomo's wife, Masako was expected to serve her husband, bear his heirs, and dutifully manage the household. She did all this and more quickly, proving herself to be intelligent, resourceful, and politically astute. When Yoritomo was away on military campaigns, Masako ably governed in his stead, advising on clan strategy and even mustering defense forces when needed. Her wisdom and competence earned her the nickname the Nun Shogun, as she skillfully balanced the roles of samurai wife, mother, and power behind the throne. In 1299, when Yoritomo died suddenly, Masako acted decisively to protect her clan's interests and young sons. Knowing that rivals would seize upon a widow's vulnerable position, she immediately took religious vows and became a Buddhist nun. This gave her a measure of protection and authority from which she could wield power and fend off threats to her family. For the next 20 years, through a combination of diplomacy, intrigue, and sheer indomitable will, Masako helped steer the Hojo clan through treacherous political currents. She brokered key alliances, outmaneuvered scheming adversaries, and secured her son's place as shogun, ruler of all Japan in name, if not always. In fact, Masako's steady hand safeguarded the Hojo regency as the dominant power for generations. Yet even the most extraordinary woman of her age could not entirely escape the trials and tragedies that marked so many female lives in feudal Japan. Of Masako's children, only a sickly son survived to adulthood. Her relationship with him was strained as she strove to make him a strong leader against his temperament. In the end, he died young, leaving the Hoa regency to more distant relatives. For all her maneuvering, Masako could not override the era's edicts on male primogeniture. As she entered old age, after a lifetime spent upholding her family's name, Masako gradually withdrew from the world of earthly affairs. She retreated to a small hermitage and devoted her final years to Buddhist practice, perhaps seeking in faith the peace and refuge she had never quite found in the turbulent realm of men. The exact date of her death is uncertain, but by most accounts she lived into her 70s, a remarkable lifespan for the time. Hojo Masako's story exemplifies both the strictures and the possibilities of being an elite woman in feudal Japan. Through accident of birth and marriage, she was thrust into the highest echelons of power. Through her own keen mind and unrelenting determination, she seized every opportunity to shape her fate and that of her clan. Yet even such an exceptionally capable noble woman could not fully unshackle herself from the bonds of her sex. Despite all her influence in matters of state, her destiny ultimately depended on the men in her life, the husband she served, the son she fought for, the nephew who would succeed her line. For each hard-won victory, the implacable force of male dominance still delimited her course. Hamasiko's experience writ large on the tapestry of history echoes the intimate struggles of countless women who lived in those long-ago times. Whether born to high or low status, samurai or peasant, each woman had to navigate a world that offered her few choices and little control over her own fate. From cradle to grave, she was at the mercy of fathers, husbands, and sons, her value measured by her utility to men. Perhaps there was a young peasant bride toiling beside her husband in the rice paddies from dawn to dusk, bearing child after child until her body broke under the strain. A samurai widow fighting to preserve her late husband's meager stipend so she might feed her children. A low-ranking concubine scheming to secure her position in a noble household lest she be cast out to fend for herself. In ways great and small, every woman had to find her own path through the maze of obligations and expectations that hemmed her in on all sides. Yet it would be a disservice to remember these women only as passive victims of their circumstance. Within the narrow confines of their prescribed roles, they nonetheless found ways to carve out lives of meaning and purpose. They planted rice, wove silk, and raised children. They formed friendships, fell in love, and grappled with heartache. They prayed to the gods and Buddhas, seeking solace and strength in the face of hardship. In the tapestry of their daily lives, woven out of myriad small joys and sorrows, these women quietly shaped the course of history, even as it pushed them to the margins. To be a woman in feudal Japan was to inhabit a world that offered little in the way of freedom or agency. It was a world of strict hierarchies and unyielding expectations, where a woman's worth was measured by her obedience and her fertility. It was a world where even the most brilliant and ambitious woman could only wield power from behind the scenes, forever dependent on the whims of men. Yet it was also a world where women found ways to endure and even thrive in defiance of the many forces arrayed against them. Through their resilience, their ingenuity, and their quiet strength, they left an indelible mark on the fabric of their society, even as their names and deeds were so often erased from the official record. As we look back across the centuries, it is easy to see only the oppression and injustice that constrained the lives of these long-ago women. But we must also remember their humanity, their tenacity, and their indomitable spirit in the face of adversity. In the end, their story is not just one of subjugation, but of survival, a testament to the enduring power of the human will to find meaning and beauty even in the most unforgiving of circumstances. So let us remember the women of feudal Japan, not just as victims of their time, but as the heroines of their own unsung epics. Let us honor their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrows and their joys, and let us carry their memory with us as a reminder of the indomitable resilience of the human spirit, which endures and flourishes even in the darkest of times. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of those long-ago women who lived and loved and fought and died in a world so different from our own, yet so achingly familiar in its essential humanity. Let us hold their stories in our hearts as a testament to the enduring strength and courage of women across the ages. And let us carry their memory with us into the dawn as a reminder that even in the face of the greatest adversity, the human spirit will always find a way to shine through. As the strict hierarchy of feudal Japanese society solidified over the centuries, so too did the subservient position of women become more entrenched. The highly patriarchal system left women with very few rights, protections, or opportunities for self-determination. Their legal status was barely above that of property or cattle. First, under the control of their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons. From birth, girls were considered less valuable than boys. While the practice was already declining by the feudal era, female infanticide, the killing of newborn baby girls, still occurred in some families, especially poor, rural households that couldn't afford more children or strongly desired a male heir. The ideal family was thought to have 3 daughters and 5 sons, but even for girls who were welcomed into the world, a difficult path lay ahead. They were raised to be subdued, obedient, and focused on domestic duties to prepare them for marriage, their overwhelmingly likely fate. Unlike their brothers, girls didn't typically receive a formal education in reading, writing, or academic subjects. A notable exception was Murasaki Shikibu, who was born into the cultured Fujiwara clan around 973 AD during the Han period. She benefited from having access to her learned father's library, where she immersed herself in Chinese classics and developed a deep love of literature and poetry. In a society where women were often discouraged from reading too much less, they become insolent. Murasaki's erudition was highly unusual. Her literary talents blossomed at court, where she served as a lady-in-waiting. During the long stretches of idle hours, Murasaki began writing the sprawling novel that would become her magnum opus, The Tale of Genji. The story of the shining Prince Genji and his many lovers was a witty, perceptive, thinly veiled critique of aristocratic life. Laced with over 800 exquisite waka poems, the 54-chapter masterpiece is considered the world's first novel and a pinnacle of classical Japanese literature. Its psychological depth, rich visual detail, and bold treatment of romance and sexuality all sprang from the mind of the court lady known as Murasaki. Against the odds, she achieved a level of education that equipped her with the tools and talent to create an enduring work of art. But Murasaki's experience was the exception, not the rule, for noble women of the age, and certainly for women of lower classes. There were few paths besides marriage available. For peasant girls, that transition might come as young as 13 or 14. Even some samurai and noble houses married off their daughters in their mid-teens to cement political alliances. Marriage was not about love, but practicality and duty. Weddings were arranged by parents with careful calculations of social rank, financial gains, and ties between extended families. The bride was expected to be virgin, obedient, skilled in homemaking, and hopefully fertile. Imagine the trepidation a girl must have felt barely into her adolescence as she left behind the only home she'd known to start a new life with her husband's family. There she would be expected to serve her in-laws and bear as many children as possible with immense pressure to produce a male heir swiftly. Infertility was always seen as the woman's fault. A bride who failed to conceive a son might find herself replaced by another wife or a concubine. Consider the case of Tokugawa Masako, born into a powerful samurai family in 607. At the tender age of 15, she was married off to the second Tokugawa shogun, Hidetada, to shore up her clan's position in the new regime her father had helped put in power. Much was riding on young Masako to ensure an heir to the shogunate. Fortunately, just shy of her 18th birthday, Masako gave birth to a healthy boy, the future third shogun, Yamitsu. She would go on to bear Hidetada 5 more children, cementing her place as a political force to be reckoned with. When her husband died, Masako took the title of Taitokuin and became a key advisor to her son, the new shogun. As a formidable daga, Masako wielded considerable influence behind the scenes of the shogunate. She issued orders, received officials, and intervened in conflicts between rival factions. When a scandal threatened Yamitsu's heirs, Masako acted quickly to preserve the line of succession. Her shrewd instincts and unwavering loyalty to the Tokugawa clan made her arguably the most powerful woman in Japan at the time. But Masako's place at the pinnacle of feudal society was rarefied air that vanishingly few women would ever breathe. For the vast majority, their adult lives revolved entirely around domestic duties, with little opportunity for anything beyond household drudgery and motherhood. A woman was judged almost solely on her ability to bear children, especially sons to carry on the family name. Frequent pregnancies were the norm for married women during their fertile years. But without access to modern medicine, these repeated pregnancies exacted a heavy toll. Complications from childbirth were a leading cause of death for women in feudal Japan. The average woman might expect to bear 5 or 6 children, but infant mortality rates were also high. Perhaps only half would survive to age 5. The physical and emotional strains of motherhood in this era were immense. The arduous reality of peasant women in particular can hardly be overstated. In addition to their maternal role, lower-caste women were expected to work alongside their husbands in the rice paddies, toiling for long hours to eke out a meagre living. Their bone-weary existence left little time for rest or respite. Imagine the life of a woman like Nano Teo, born into a farming family during the peaceful but rigid Tokugawa period. From a young age, Teo would have been put to work feeding livestock, hauling water, weeding fields, processing crops, all on top of cooking, cleaning, sewing, and minding younger siblings. Swiftly married off to another farm family as a teenage bride, her grueling labor would only intensify. Rising before dawn to stoke the cooking fires, Tako's calloused hands would prepare the morning meal for her husband and in-laws before heading out to the patties. Knee-deep in muddy water, she'd bend double to plant, weed, and harvest the household staple crop. Returning sore and soaked, an endless list of domestic chores still remained. Perhaps the sole respite from Teo's unrelenting daily grind was the communal bath at the end of the day. There she could shed her sweat-streaked clothes to sink into the warm, women-only sanctuary of the neighborhood bathhouse. Amid clouds of soothing steam, the farm wives would finally find a moment to rest, gossip, and escape their cares before the cycle began anew the next morning. Year after year, through multiple pregnancies, Tiao's sturdy peasant body would be her most valuable asset, even as it gradually wore down under the weight of ceaseless labor and childbearing. If she survived into old age, her GNL'd hands and stooped back would tell the story of a lifetime of hardship, all too common for women of her station. But even a woman of the upper echelons could not fully escape the confines imposed upon her gender. Social class was the single greatest determinant of a woman's quality of life in feudal Japan. But strict laws regulated the privileges afforded to each stratum of society. From the cut of their kimonos to the ingredients in their kitchens, every aspect was prescribed by a woman's rank. Sumptuary laws laid out in exacting detail what each tier could wear, eat, and own. For example, only women of the imperial family were permitted silk robes with 5 layers. Ladies in waiting made do with 4 layers, while townswomen were limited to cotton. These rigid rules ensured women knew their place and seldom attempted to reach beyond it. Still, each class had its particular hardships and hazards. Peasant women, as we've seen, faced lives of punishing drudgery in the fields. Merchant wives were somewhat better off materially, but were still largely confined to the domestic sphere, assisting their husbands' businesses from behind the scenes. Even the relative comfort enjoyed by samurai and noble women came at the steep cost of freedom. For the daughters of the warrior class, a certain degree of education was permitted, even expected. Most samurai girls learned to read and write, usually tutored at home. Some were even trained in self-defense to protect the household when their men folk were away at war. A lucky few, like Murasaki Shikibu, even had the opportunity to let their intellectual talents flourish. But such privileges were counterbalanced by the rigid behavioral constraints put upon upper-class women. Noble women in particular led sheltered, circumscribed lives, rarely permitted to leave their gilded cages. When they did venture out, such as to attend a temple ceremony or wedding, they would be cloaked beneath many layers of sumptuous kimono, their faces hidden behind elaborate screens. Etiquette was everything for a well-born lady. From a young age, girls were rigorously drilled in the arts of calligraphy, poetry, music, and incense appreciation. A premium was placed on elegance, erudition, and absolute discretion. Even the way a noble woman walked was prescribed. Small shuffling steps, eyes downcast, a practiced dance of docile subservience. While peasant women's value lay in their ability to bear children and work ceaselessly, noble women's currency was their virginity, fertility, and unimpeachable reputation. Even a whisper of scandal could irreparably tarnish a high-ranking lady's standing and marriage prospects. Reputational damage could taint her entire family status by association. Thus, the cultivation of impeccable deport and untarnished virtue was paramount for women of the ruling class. They may have had more creature comforts than their lower-ass counterparts, but the fetters of propriety and pedigree bound them just as tightly. Yet even in this rigidly hierarchical world, there were rare women who managed to transcend the limitations placed on their gender to wield real power and influence. These exceptional ladies, whether by accident of birth, force of personality, or sheer grit and guile, carved out spaces for themselves in the nearly exclusively male enclaves of government and warfare. One such formidable figure was Hojo Masako, born around 1157 into a powerful samurai clan. At 13, Masako was married off to the rising warlord Minamoto no Yoritomo. But this was no ordinary political match. Masako's father had been a rival of Yoritomo, a vendetta that ended with the bride's male relatives being executed and the clan subjugated by the Minamoto. The marriage was likely intended to neutralize the threat of Hojo retaliation, but Masako was no meek pawn content to accept her family's defeat. From the start, she used her brilliance and nerve to turn the tables on the husband who had vanquished her kin. Masako quickly proved herself an indispensable advisor to Yoritomo as he worked to consolidate power. Her political acumen and samurai pedigree equipped her to be a savvy strategist and administrator. As his confidant and co-conspirator, she helped him overthrow the ruling Taira clan to become the supreme military dictator of Japan, the first shogun. Yoritomo clearly respected his wife as a force to be reckoned with. He is said to have called her his other self. Some of his top generals even complained about the disproportionate sway Masako seemed to hold over the mighty warlord. But Maso was just getting started. When Yoritomo died unexpectedly in 1199, she sprang into action to protect her clan's position. In a bold power play, Maso had her father appointed regent to her son, the child shogun making the Hojo the de facto rulers behind the throne. For the next 20 years, Masako was the eminence grey of the shogunate, masterminding her clan's dominance. While she was compelled to rule through male puppets, there was no mistaking that Masako was truly pulling the strings. She had secured her place in the very upper echelons of feudal power, virtually unheard of for a woman of the age. Masako's fierce ambition and tenacity in the face of adversity was extraordinary. That a teenage bride from a defeated family could end up in a position to dictate the affairs of the shogunate speaks to her keen intelligence, political cunning, and sheer force of will. While she could not escape all of the usual limitations and indignities visited upon women, she pushed their boundaries further than most could dream. But Masako and her ilk were the exceptions that proved the rule in feudal Japan. For the overwhelming majority of women, their lives and identities were subsumed by their roles as wives and mothers, with precious little autonomy or self-determination afforded to them. Even a woman's experience of pregnancy and childbirth, her most elemental biological function was rigidly controlled by the mores and superstitions of the era. Menstruating women were considered ritually unclean, their blood thought to be dangerously polluting. During their monthly cycles, women were often confined to separate quarters and barred from preparing food or entering sacred spaces. This stigma extended to childbirth as well. Partition huts called ubuya were set up away from the main house for women to deliver their babies. These birthing huts were dark, dirty, and poorly ventilated, a reflection of the perceived taint of the process. After the birth, the new mother would need to stay in seclusion in the ubuya for a period of days or weeks until she was considered cleansed. Only then could she return to the bosom of her family with her newborn. This isolation during such a vulnerable time, sequestered as if diseased, speaks volumes about the abiding unease around the fundamental female capacity to create new life. These entrenched tabos around the mysteries of womanhood, seen as simultaneously alluring and unsettling, shaped societal attitudes for centuries. Even as the feudal era gave way to the more modern Meiji period in the late 19th century, these deep-rooted stigmas persisted. The impurity of women's biology was even codified into law in the Meiji Civil Code of 1896. This family law system, while ostensibly a modernizing move, still enshrined many of the old iniquities and patriarchal structures. Adultery remained a criminal offense for women, but not for men. Women were obliged to wait 6 months to remarry after a divorce, due to an archaic belief they would not know the father of a child born too soon. Up until the mid-10th century, many temples and sumo wrestling tournaments still banned women due to menstrual taboos. Some Shinto shrines had stones where women could stand to watch festivals, careful not to contaminate the sacred grounds. These enduring pockets of gender discrimination, holdovers from the feudal past, underscored just how rigid and deep-seated attitudes about women's inherent inferiority were in Japanese culture. For all the seismic social shifts of the late 1800s, true female emancipation would prove to be a slow, incremental battle against centuries of oppressive tradition. But even in the medieval era, some women were striving mightily against their prescribed roles, carving out unlikely niches for themselves on the margins of this male-dominated society. One realm where women could occasionally wield some measure of influence and independence was perhaps, surprisingly, within religious orders. Buddhism had been introduced to Japan in the 6th century and steadily gained traction in the ensuing centuries. By the feudal era, it was firmly established as one of the country's major faiths alongside the indigenous religion of Shintoism. These belief systems would intertwine to deeply influence Japanese culture and daily life. For women in particular, Buddhism offered some rare avenues for education, leadership, and spiritual authority, denied to them in secular society. Noble women were known to take vows as nuns, sometimes in widowhood, or as a way to escape the confines of arranged marriages. Inside convents and monasteries, these women would be freed from their usual domestic duties to immerse themselves in scripture, meditation, and ascetic practices. Some even had opportunities to travel on pilgrimages to holy sites or study under eminent monks. Religion provided a sliver of space for women to exist outside of their relationships to men as wives, mothers, and daughters. The temple Hokkaji in En is a potent symbol of this phenomenon. Founded in 745 by the Empress Kommo, Hokkaji was Japan's first convent established to pray for the soul of the empress's deceased mother. The temple housed both nuns and monks in its sprawling grounds, with women serving as abuses and administrators. For centuries, Hoki was a thriving center of female Buddhist practice and scholarship. Court ladies and noble women from across Japan's provinces would flock there to take religious vows and immerse themselves in clerical life. The convent was renowned for its beautiful gardens, tranquil atmosphere, and the erudition of its nuns. Heiji stands as a testament to the indomitable will of women determined to find avenues for learning and contemplation. In a world that sought to constrain them to the domestic sphere, it speaks to the thirst for knowledge and self-actualization that simmered beneath the placid surface of even the most privileged women's lives. The Empress Kommo herself was an exemplar of the kind of quiet sub. Moisuke Chiyome was a remarkable woman who defied convention in feudal Japan. Born into the influential Koga ninja clan, Moisuke lost her samurai husband, Moisuke Muratki, in the Battle of Okahazama in 1560. Newly widowed in her mid-20s, Moisuke could have retreated into the expected life of a grieving noble woman, but instead she approached her uncle, the powerful warlord Taida Shingen, with a daring proposition. Machisuke had a vision of a new kind of fighting force, an all-female group of ninja agents specially trained in espionage, sabotage, and assassination. In the Mali-dominated world of samurai warfare, it was almost unthinkable. But Taida saw the potential in his niece's idea and tasked her with making it a reality. So Machisuke set to work building her network of kunoichi, or female ninja operatives. She recruited girls and young women who had been orphaned, widowed, or cast out by their families. Those on the margins of society who had little to lose. Moisuke offered them a new purpose and a way to survive in a harsh world. At Mochisuke's hidden training camps in the mountains, the kunoichi learned the arts of stealth, disguise, and infiltration. They were taught to blend in seamlessly with any level of society. From the lowliest peasants to the wealthiest nobility, Moisuke drilled them mercilessly in martial arts, teaching them to wield daggers, throw shuriken, and deliver lethal poison. Perhaps most importantly, she trained them to use their wits and feminine Ws to manipulate men and extract vital secrets. Before long, Mochisuke had assembled a formidable force of some 200 to 300 konoichi agents, fiercely loyal to her and the Taida clan. She dispatched them on missions deep into enemy territory where they could move about freely in guises as unassuming as maids, entertainers, or priests. They eavesdropped in tea houses, seduced secrets from loose-lipped officials, and assassinated key targets when the need arose. Diligent and deadly, Mochizuki's kunoichi proved their worth as the Takada clan's shadowy secret weapon. For over a decade, until the Takada clan fell in 1582, Mochizuki's kunoichi network operated in the shadows, changing the course of battles and turning the tides of power. While the kunoichi were undeniably feared and effective, Mochizuki's true legacy lay in proving that women were just as capable as men of altering history from behind the scenes. Through her visionary leadership, she offered hundreds of disadvantaged women a chance at an independent life in a society that so often confined them. While Mochizuki's own fate after the Takada's fall is unknown, her groundbreaking kunoichi force was just one of many ways that exceptional women managed to carve out agency and influence even within feudal Japan's rigid gender roles. Like a thorn in the side of the samurai patriarchy, Mochizuki and her female ninja operatives left an indelible mark on history, one shrouded in mist and mystery, much like the kunoichi themselves. But while women like Mochizuki occasionally broke new ground, they were very much the exception to the rule. For the vast majority of women in feudal Japan, the chief purpose in life was not to change history, but to bear the children who would carry on their husband's family lineage. The pressure to produce heirs, especially sons, was immense. A married woman's worth was defined largely by her fertility and her ability to give her husband's family the next generation. Bearing children in feudal Japan was a dangerous endeavor. Medical knowledge was primitive by today's standards, and women often gave birth at home with only the help of a midwife or female relatives. Complications like preeclampsia, obstructed labor, and postpartum hemorrhage claimed countless mothers' lives. Infants, too, frequently perished from infection, malnutrition, or birth defects. For a peasant woman who needed to return to backbreaking labor in the field soon after delivery, the risks were even greater. Consider the story of Nano Teo, a farmer's wife in the 14th century Ume province. Married at 15 to a man twice her age, Nano was expected to work alongside him in the rice paddies and mulberry fields, in addition to cooking, cleaning, and sewing for her in-laws. Within a year of the wedding, she was pregnant with their first child. The delivery of the baby boy was long and excruciating. Squatting on the dirt floor of their hut, Nano labored for 2 days until she was half delirious with fatigue. The village midwife, a wizened old woman who smelled of sweat and herbs, muttered prayers and massaged Nano's straining belly. When the baby finally slithered out blue and worryingly silent, Nano closed her eyes, certain the ordeal had been in vain. But then a thin wail pierced the air as the midwife swatted the newborn to life. He would survive this time. Over the next 2 decades, Nana would go through this ordeal again and again, 6 times in total. 4 more of her babies would live, and one, a girl, would die shortly after birth, taking a piece of Nano's scarred heart with her. In between pregnancies, Nano hauled water, pounded millet, and nursed fevers through grinding poverty and seasonal starvation. The children she bore were both her greatest comfort and her heaviest burden. Nano was just one of countless unsung women who formed the backbone of feudal Japanese society. With no access to birth control and little choice about their fates, They were expected to bear as many children as their bodies would allow. Even the luckiest and most affluent of them could never fully escape the risks of childbirth, nor the social pressure to keep producing heirs until they either succeeded or perished in the attempt. But through their sacrifices, these anonymous mothers did give life to one significant force for change within feudal society. The Buddhist nunneries that offered women a rare alternative to marriage and motherhood. While not an easy life by any means, taking religious vows allowed some girls to avoid the relentless cycle of pregnancy and labor, and to gain a modicum of education and agency. In the cloisters, they might learn to read and write, pursuing poetry, music, or handicrafts in relative peace. One famous example was the noble woman Hojo Masako, heir to a powerful samurai clan. Flouting convention, Hojo never married, choosing instead to become a lay nun at the age of 33. From behind the walls of her family's temple, she advised her male relatives on military strategy and helped steer the clan through treacherous political waters for decades. While she lived in quiet service to the Buddha, her sharp political acumen earned her a nickname that struck fear into the hearts of her rivals, the nun shogun, a power behind the throne, cloaked in a nun's simple robes. For Hojo, religious life was both a refuge and a seat of influence, one where her gifts could flourish beyond the confines of marriage and motherhood. She wielded the Dharma like the samurai sword she had never been allowed to carry, carving out a space for her own authority and intellect in feudal Japan's male-dominated world. And through her patronage and example, she undoubtedly inspired other women to find their own unconventional paths to wisdom and self-determination, even within the rigid limits of their age's gender expectations. As the sun rose over Hojo's temple and well-worn sandals padded through hushed halls to morning prayers, a new generation of Japanese girls dreamed that they too might one day choose a life beyond the birthing bed. With each humble bowl of rice and each resonant chant, they tended that fragile shoot of female agency, hoping it would someday blossom into a world where all women could shape their own destinies. Until then, the nunneries would remain a cherished sanctuary, a place where women could be reborn on their own terms, even in a society that often saw them as little more than vessels for the next generation of men. From the venerable temples to the lowliest peasant huts, feudal Japan was a complex tapestry of female lives and fates. Certainly the era was brutally unequal, with women's roles circumscribed by rigid social mores and male authority. But within those constraints, women like Mochizuki Chiyomi, Hojo Masako, and countless unsung heroines found ways to shape history and leave their marks on a society that too often overlooked their talents and sacrifices. Through guile, grit, and quiet subversion, they laid the groundwork for the slow march toward women's liberation in Japan. A journey that would take many centuries more. And as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us dream of them. The hidden kunoichi and the wise old nuns, the battle-weary widows and the bright-eyed peasant girls. May we honor their resilience and carry forward their legacy, knowing that each of us stands on the shoulders of the visionary women who came before. Good night, and sweet dreams of a world transformed by women's strength. Late life for women in feudal Japan was often a time of increased hardship and vulnerability, especially for those who had survived the perils of multiple childbirths. By their 40s and 50s, many women were considered old, their youth and fertility behind them. Those lucky enough to still have a living husband now faced the prospect of widowhood, as men frequently died before their wives due to war, dangerous occupations, or the ravages of a hard life. A widow's fate could be precarious. With little ability to earn an income herself, she was reliant on the support of her grown children, or male relatives. If she had no family to turn to, or they were unable or unwilling to help, she might be forced into begging to survive. Picture an elderly woman, her body bent from years of physical labor, her face lined with grief and worry, holding out a trembling hand to passers-by on the street, hoping for a few coins or scraps of food. Some older women sought solace and security in religion. Buddhism offered a socially acceptable path for widows or those seeking a more contemplative life. Women could become nuns, living out their days in the simple, structured environment of a temple. There they might find a sense of community among other women, as well as a higher purpose in religious devotion and service. Wealthier women who had the means might go on pilgrimages to sacred sites, earning merit for the next life while escaping the confines of the home in their remaining years. But this autonomy was rare. Most older women still lived under the authority of a male relative, following the same conventions of filial piety and obedience they had observed since childhood. A fascinating example of a woman who wielded influence even in late life is Hoyo Masako. Born into the powerful Hojo clan in 1156, Masako navigated the treacherous world of feudal politics with intelligence and skill. She married the shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo and bore him 2 sons, securing the family line. After her husband's death, Masako became a lay nun, as was common for elite widows. But rather than retiring quietly to a temple, she continued to shape events behind the scenes. Through clever political maneuvering, Masako helped her father and then her second son become shoguns, cementing the Hojo clan's dominance. She communicated with officials, issued orders, and even led troops into battle to protect her family's interests. Nicknamed the nun shogun, Masako defied conventions to hold sway in a male-dominated system, earning grudging respect from allies and enemies alike. But such a remarkable figure was the exception, not the rule, and her elite samurai status granted her far more latitude than common women enjoyed. For the vast majority of women in feudal Japan, old age was a time of diminishing options and deepening dependence, when the limitations and disparities that circumscribed their lives only intensified. As a woman's life drew to a close, she could reflect on the narrow path she had walked. From a childhood focused on preparing for marriage, to an adulthood spent bearing children and serving the needs of men to an old age, reliant on the goodwill of male kin, she had endured much with little freedom to determine her own fate. Perhaps on her deathbed she might ponder the daughters and granddaughters who would follow after her. Would their lives be different? Or would they too be constrained by the same rigid gender roles and societal expectations? Change, if it came, would not come quickly. The legacy of women's hardship and resilience in feudal Japan would endure for generations to follow. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through the life stages of women in feudal Japan, we can only marvel at the strength and perseverance of these individuals. From birth to death, they faced unimaginable challenges and restrictions. Yet they found ways to survive and even carve out small spaces of agency and meaning in a world stacked against them. Their stories serve as a reminder of the profound inequalities and injustices of the past, and the ongoing struggle for women's rights and freedoms that continues to this day. By understanding and honoring the experiences of these long-ago women, we can draw inspiration for the work that still needs to be done to create a more just and equitable world for all. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold in our hearts the memory of these women, the nameless multitudes who toiled and endured in the shadows of history. May their courage and resilience light the way forward as we strive to build a future where every person, regardless of gender, can live a life of dignity, opportunity, and choice. Continued from previous section, Hojo Masako's influence even in her elderly years was a testament to her remarkable life. But for most women, growing old meant facing new hardships in an unforgiving society. With each passing year, a woman's value and status diminished further. Those who were fortunate enough to have surviving children, especially sons, could hope to be cared for in their twilight years. But for the many women who were widowed, childless, or destitute, the autumn of life brought only greater struggle and isolation. With no social safety net or support system beyond their families, elderly women were at the mercy of their kin or lack thereof. The lucky ones might reside with their grown children and help care for their own grandchildren, looking on as a new generation of women began the same difficult cycle anew. Others, however, found themselves utterly cast aside, shunned as burdens with nothing more to offer. On the fringes of society, some widows and spinsters sought solace in spirituality, becoming Buddhist nuns or devoting themselves to religious communities. In their final decades within temple life, these women could find a modicum of purpose, support, and belonging in a world that otherwise discarded them. The Buddhist principles of detachment and transcending worldly suffering perhaps brought a measure of peace to weary hearts. Yet many other elderly women had no such recourse. With no temple to take them in, no children to rely on, and no means to support themselves, they were left destitute and desperate. In the shadows of villages and towns, these forgotten women grasped for survival by any means they could, begging, foraging, or quietly withering away. Their plight was a stark reminder of the precariousness of a woman's existence in feudal Japan, where her welfare was always contingent on the men in her life. As a woman reached the end of her days, she could reflect on a lifetime shaped by the unyielding strictures of her society. From the moment she drew her first breath as a swaddled infant, her path had been laid out before her. A narrow road bound by duty, obedience, and self-sacrifice. At every stage, her worth had been measured by her utility to the men who controlled her destiny. Her joys and comforts had been meager, her hardships and trials many. But perhaps in quiet moments, she also remembered the small triumphs and secret strengths that had sustained her. The personal resilience she had forged through enduring each day in an unequal world. The bonds of solidarity she had shared with other women. Even as the rules of society conspired to isolate and silence them, the flashes of beauty, love, and laughter that had illuminated even the darkest times. As her eyes closed one last time, she left behind a complex legacy, one of oppression and indomitable spirit, of subjugation and subtle resistance, of lives half-lived and battles hard fought. Hers was the story of countless women who came before and would come after, navigating an unfair world with as much grit and grace as they could muster. And though the wheels of history would not noticeably budge in feudal Japan, This woman and her sisters helped lay the long foundation for a slowly changing society. In ways big and small, seen and unseen, the women of feudal Japan were more than victims of their age. They were shapers of a future they could scarcely imagine but would never witness. So as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us hold a space in our hearts for these long-ago women and the lives they led. May we honor their struggles, salute their strengths, and find inspiration in their quiet courage. And may we resolve to keep bending the long arc of history towards a world where every woman can step into the fullness of her being, free and unburdened. At last, as we've seen, a woman's social class greatly shaped her quality of life in feudal Japan. Peasant women faced backbreaking labor in the fields alongside their husbands and children. Rising before dawn, they planted and harvested rice, the staple crop that sustained the nation. With calloused hands, they wielded heavy tools to till the earth. Babies strapped to their backs, they bent for hours under the scorching sun and pouring rain. Hunger was a constant spectre. A poor harvest could spell starvation. The wives of samurai, in contrast, were spared this punishing field work. As members of the warrior class, they enjoyed a higher status and standard of living. Yet their lives were far from leisurely. Managing the household and serving their husbands and parents-in-law were their primary duties. Some samurai women also learned the arts of self-defense, trained to protect their homes and villages when the men were away at war. They practiced wielding the naginata, a long curved blade on a pole, with strength and precision. One remarkable samurai wife was Hojo Masako, who lived from 1156 to 1225. Born into the powerful Hojo clan, she was married off to the shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo at age 15 to forge a political alliance. When her husband died, Masako took the reins of power to safeguard her family's influence. With shrewd acumen, she maneuvered her clan to control the shogunate government behind the scenes for over a century. Known as the nun shogun, Masako became a Buddhist nun in her later years, but never relinquished her authority. As influential as Masako was, most samurai women focused on the domestic realm. They were responsible for all the housework, including cleaning, cooking, and sewing. Producing and repairing the family's clothing was an endless task. Using spindles and looms, women wove fabric from cotton and silk, stitching the cloth into kimono, hakama trousers, and other garments. Detailed embroidery and intricate dyeing showcased their skills. A samurai wife took pride in her family's immaculate appearance, as their dress signaled their rank and prestige. For noble women at the very apex of society, life was cloistered and stifling. Sheltered in sprawling castle compounds, the daughters of daimos and aristocrats rarely ventured outside. Their world was one of ornate screens, tatami mats, and brocade cushions. Beneath the finery, however, lay a gilded cage. Noble women spent their days in the women's quarters, segregated from men. They passed the time in refined pastimes, suited to their rank, like calligraphy, flower arranging, poetry, and music. The plucking of a koto and the whisper of a brush on paper echoed through the hallways. Etiquette was paramount. Noble women were expected to master the art of conversation and manners to reflect well on their families. Their speech, posture, and gestures were endlessly refined. Elaborate beauty rituals consumed the noble women's hours. They grew their hair long, the shining dresses reaching past their waists. Styling the hair was a laborious process, as it was washed with rice water, combed with oils, and arranged into elegant coiffure with pins and combs. Faces were powdered ghostly white, eyebrows plucked and redrawn high on the forehead. Blackened teeth achieved by applying a sticky iron liquid were considered beautiful. All of this priming was in service of the noble lady's primary role to be a desirable bride and forge a profitable match for her family. Marriages among the ruling elite were not affairs of the heart, but calculated power plays to consolidate wealth, land, and political clout. A noble woman was a pawn in this game, her life not her own. Once married off, usually as a teenager, she would move to her husband's household. There, a noble wife had to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and interpersonal rivalries. Pleasing her mother-in-law and husband was crucial to secure her position. But noblemen commonly kept multiple concubines, and a wife's status could be undermined at any moment by a younger, more favored mistress. The main consorts of elite men wielded the most power and respect as they bore the heirs. For secondary wives and concubines, life was often lonely and precarious. Despite the cushioned luxury of their surroundings, the emotional and psychological toll on noble women was immense. Living only to serve the whims of men valued solely for their beauty, fertility, and pedigree. Their existence had a suffocating emptiness. They poured their silent sorrows and secret longings into the poetry and diaries that were their sole outlets for self-expression. In this rarefied world beyond the nobility, women of all classes found some escape from the rigid gender roles through religion. Buddhism had spread throughout Japan in the feudal era, and women embraced it as a path to enlightenment and social service. Becoming a nun offered a rare alternative to the prescribed course of marriage and motherhood. Noble women, samurai wives, and peasant women alike took vows and entered convents in their later years, often after being widowed. In the holy order, they were liberated from the subservience of secular life. As nuns, they could devote themselves to spiritual practice, temple duties, and charitable works. Some even became influential abbesses, presiding over religious communities and shaping the Buddhist faith. One such woman was Empress Komo, who lived in the 8th century. Born Princess Asukabime, she married Emperor Shomu and reigned alongside him. A devout Buddhist, Ko used her exalted position to advance the Dharma. She founded Hoki, a grand temple, and commissioned the stunning Kofuku-ji temple complex. At these sites, the empress established orders of nuns and convents to educate women. Komeo's most enduring legacy was the Field of Compassion, a vast charitable project to aid the poor and sick. She donated huge tracts of land to grow crops to feed the needy. The empress opened hospitals and dispensaries to treat the ill and distributed clothing to the destitute. By some accounts, she even carried firewood to the hovels of the impoverished with her own hands, offering solace and dignity. In Komeo's life story, we see a glimmer of how women could transcend the usual bonds of gender and class through religious devotion and compassionate action. For most women, however, the fetters of custom and duty were not so easily shed. From cradle to grave, their lives were circumscribed by the narrow roles ascribed to their sex. Ideal femininity in feudal Japan meant dility, obedience, chastity, and above all the sacrifice of personal desires for familial harmony. This left little room for women's self-determination or fulfillment. As the years passed and a woman grew old, she remained entangled in this web of obligation. If she was lucky enough to survive the perils of childbirth and raise her children to adulthood, Her twilight years might be spent in the care of her sons and daughters-in-law. Yet, even as an elder, a woman was still subordinate to the males in the family. Without a husband or son to rely on, a widow was especially vulnerable, dependent on her relatives for support, or reduced to begging in the streets. In this final stage of life, some women found solace in religion, making pilgrimages to holy sites or retreating to a nunnery. Others poured their hard-earned wisdom into guiding the younger generations, hoping to spare them some of the trials they had endured. But for many, the end came with little fanfare, their histories unrecorded, their hardships unremarked. They passed from this world as they had lived in it, invisible and unsung. Looking back across the centuries, we catch but fleeting glimpses of the lives of women in feudal Japan. Through fading ink on weathered pages, in the strokes of a pen, or the stitches of an embroidery, their experiences are transmitted to us in fragments. The poems, diaries, and legends left behind hint at the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and trials that shape their days. What emerges is a portrait of resilience in the face of adversity. Though constricted by a rigid social order, women found ways to carve meaning and beauty from their allotted circumstances. They birthed and reared children, labored and toiled, navigated court intrigues and village squabbles. Some, through sheer strength of will or quirks of fate, even rose to wield influence in a world that denied them formal power. Yet the overwhelming reality for most women was one of subjugation, their lives given over to the service of men. The diverse roles they played, wife, mother, daughter, concubine, none, were parts they were born to inhabit, not free to choose. To be a woman in feudal Japan was to live within the unyielding boundaries of this script, to endure with grace the heavy costumes and the often tragic endings. In our modern age, it is all too easy to imagine these women's lives as distant and foreign, separated from us by an unbridgeable chasm of time and culture. But if we listen closely to the whispers that echo across the ages, we may find a common thread that binds us to our foremothers. For though the trappings of the tale may change, the struggles of the heart remain constant. In the face of entrenched inequalities, women then and now have had to find their own paths to fulfillment, carving out spaces of agency and self-expression wherever they could. They have fought overtly and covertly to expand the roles open to them and to rewrite the scripts that would limit their potential. This perhaps is the enduring legacy of the women of feudal Japan. A testament to the unquenchable spark of the human spirit that refuses to be snuffed out no matter how strong the forces array against it. So, as we close this chapter of history, let us carry forward the lessons these women's lives can teach us. Let us honor their sacrifices and celebrate their victories, however small or unsung. And let us strive to create a world where no woman's fate is sealed by the circumstances of her birth, where every woman has the freedom to write her own story. The women of feudal Japan may have been born into a society that sought to constrain them at every turn, but they never stopped struggling against those bonds in their quiet acts of defiance and their determined efforts to find meaning and purpose within their prescribed roles. They planted the seeds of change that would bear fruit long after their own lifetimes. Their stories, half lost to the mists of time, remind us of the indomitable power of the human will to endure, and inch by inch to reshape the world into a fairer, more just place. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry these women in our hearts. These dreamers and fighters, these wives and mothers and nuns and shoguns, let us remember their struggles and their strength, and let us honor their memory by continuing the work they began, the work of building a world where every woman's voice can be heard and every woman's story can be told. Good night. As we've seen, even wealthy and influential women like Hojo Masako couldn't fully escape the confines of their gender roles. In her later years, after a lifetime of political maneuvering and clan leadership behind the scenes, Masako took the toner and became a Buddhist nun. This was a common path for aristocratic women once they reached old age. Retiring to a temple allowed them to withdraw from worldly affairs and devote themselves to prayer and spiritual pursuits. But even as a nun, Masako couldn't completely let go of her political instincts. When her son was forced to abdicate as shogun, she orchestrated a coup to restore her clan's power, rallying Hojo loyalists from her convent. Masako's story epitomizes how some exceptional women found ways to influence events and wield authority, even within an oppressive system. But they were very much the exception. For the vast majority of women, religious life was less about intrigue than solace and security in their twilight years. Pilgrimages to holy sites were another way older women might find some independence and mobility in a society that normally kept them homebound. These journeys offered a rare chance to travel and socialize beyond their villages under the operatives of spiritual devotion. Poorer women without family support joined pilgrimages out of necessity as a licensed form of begging. Some even became permanent pilgrims, wandering from shrine to sustain themselves, whether seeking enlightenment or just basic sustenance. A woman's final years typically remain precarious and dependent on men. With limited options to support herself, no legal rights, and fading physical strength, an elderly peasant woman might hope at best for the forbearance of her male kin, or failing that the charity of monks and nuns. So from cradle to grave, a woman's path in feudal Japan was rarely her own to choose. Her life's major junctures, birth, coming of age, marriage, childbearing, widowhood, religious vows, and death, were all shaped by the mandates of a starkly patriarchal society. At each stage, her worth was tied to her role in perpetuating the family and serving the domestic sphere. Some resisted these constraints more boldly than others. The feudal era had its share of rebel nuns, unconventional thinkers, and even women warriors, but they stood out precisely because they defied the prescribed norms. The good wife, wise mother ideal left little room for such departures. Over the centuries, that feminine archetype would only grow more entrenched. Even as feudal Japan gave way to the modern age, elements of the feudal mindset toward women, defining their value in terms of obedience, fertility, and household labor, proved surprisingly persistent. While the rigidities of class and samurai culture have faded, echoes of old attitudes about a woman's place still percolate in more contemporary expectations. Of course, the intervening years have brought hard-won progress and freedoms unimaginable to the women of the Warring States era. But the weight of historical inertia can be slow to lift, and even modern societies grapple with unresolved inequities rooted in the past. For the women of feudal Japan, the good old days were rarely that. They toiled under conditions to make even a stout-hearted male samurai blanch. Yet there is something to admire in their tenacity, resourcefulness, and dignity in the face of relentless subjugation. Through centuries of upheaval and privation, these women quietly held together the social fabric household by household. Amid wars, famines, and disasters, they brought forth new generations and passed down essential wisdom, skills, and cultural touchstone. Their sacrifices and strength, however unsung, helped civilization endure. So the next time you see a demurely smiling geisha or a kimono-clad noblewoman in a period drama, consider the millennia of unimaginably hard living those images paper over. Spare a thought for the anonymous multitudes who struggled and survived in the shadows of feudal Japan's male-dominated world. Their individual triumphs and tragedies may be lost to history, but their collective story is one of all-inspiring grit and grace under fire. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the harrowing history of women's lives in feudal Japan. I hope you found it equal parts enlightening and soporific. If you enjoyed this deep dive into an often overlooked corner of the past, please consider subscribing to this channel for more immersive bedtime adventures spanning the ages. There are so many more untold histories to explore and boring by lanes to lull you into dreamland. Until next time, sweet dreams and sayonara from the land of the rising sun and setting daughters. This is your faithful, sleep-inducing storyteller signing off.